Another reason that I like to have my line art as separate from my live paint layer is that now I can put my line art on top. I can select it and say I wanted my line art to actually be red, or yeah, why not, red. And I wanted it to be really fat. So I can make all of that. What? Oh, it didn't take for some reason. So I've selected all of my line art just by clicking this area, and that selects everything that's in that layer. And then I've told it that I want it to be orange, and I'm going to tell it that I want it to be a really high stroke weight. And now you can see that I've, without even adjusting my live paint layer, I've turned my line art, or the outlines of these shapes, to be orange. You can kind of see that it didn't work very well because of some of those fat stroke weights that it detected earlier, but that's sort of the detail that you can fix if it comes up for you. Often that's not really an issue. You can also change the stroke colors in live paint by just defining them in your thing and then coloring them in, and for some reason it's not working on this. I have gotten it to work in some cases, and in some cases I have not, which is why I prefer to do it this way, with a layer on top that is just the line art that I can change very easily, and I know exactly how it's going to work, if that makes sense. So any questions about live paint? Keeping in mind that I'm not that great at it, but I get it to work. Say again? K is the hotkey for the paint bucket. Okay, so it's already 5. Is there anything in particular that you guys wanted to see? I'll show you the gradient that we used earlier. So we were just talking about how to create something that looks like it's in 3D. And we did that by creating this very basic cylinder. I'll do it for you again. So I'm just creating an ellipse, and then I am creating lines. The line tool is this one, and that'll create straight lines that you click and drag instead of the pen tool where you would click and then click again and it would connect those two vertices. With the line tool, you click and drag. If you hold down Shift, it'll do it on one of these 45-degree angles that you can see. And so I'm going to create a line tool that's that's perfectly attached to the anchor of that ellipse, and then I'm going to do another one there, and it's telling me that I've lined up with my previous one. This is why the smart guides can be really useful. And then I'm actually going to copy, Command C, this ellipse, and then Command F, paste in front. And now I'm just going to use the down arrow, or actually the Shift down arrow in this case, to make it move a little faster, to bring that down. Or I can drag and hold down Shift so that it doesn't move side to side while I'm dragging. And I'm going to bring it down here, and I actually just want to have, I don't want my cylinder to look like it's see-through, I want it to look solid, so I'm just going to direct select that vertex and delete it, and now my cylinder has a top that you can sort of see the shape of and a bottom that you can't see through, and that would be more convincing if this didn't have a fill color. So it looks like that. So now I've created what looks like a solid object. I'm going to give this a solid fill, but I want to give this part a gradient fill. And if I just select it like that, remember these are 3 separate vectors, and we're not in live paint mode, so if I try to give those a fill, it's not going to work, right? Because a line doesn't have a fill. This line doesn't have a fill. This half ellipse does have a fill, but it's not what I really wanted it to be. So what I'm going to do instead, this is a really handy trick for when you're just doing a couple of things. I'm using direct selection to select both of those vertices that define that junction there. And then I'm going to do Command J, which is join, and I believe that's under the object menu. And I'm going to do it again over here, Command J. And they have to be endpoints on a line. You can't just pick any random vertex to do this with. But I've picked those 2 endpoints and I've joined them. And now this is one object, so I can click and drag it and they all move as one, right? That is a true object where everything is connected. So now I can give it a fill color and it will fill the whole object, right? But in this case, I want to give it a fill gradient. So I'm going to go over here. You can see gradient, color, none. So before we had color, now I'm going to choose gradient. It's giving me orange because that's the last gradient that I used, but I can change that by clicking on this button here. That'll tell me, okay, that's the color of that side of the gradient. This is the color of this side. Uh-oh, why is it only black and white? I have to tell it that I want it to be in CMYK. So I'm going to do this one from green to blue because that's pretty. I can change it to a radial gradient if I want. For this particular thing, a linear gradient is going to look better. So you can see it's given it that gradient. I can also change, it's easier to see if you can see what's happening while I do it. I can change the angle at which that gradient occurs. So you can see now it's coming from the bottom corner instead of from side to side. If I didn't mean to do that, I believe 0 is probably what I wanted it to be. So 0 is from side to side. And you can see that since I had that top of the cylinder selected, it gave that a gradient too, which I didn't want. Also, that top of the cylinder is behind the front, so it looks funny now, right? There's a hotkey for this, but you can also just right-click on it and do Arrange, Bring to Front. And those are on the same layer, so you have to arrange them in that way. You could also make them separate layers if you wanted to. So now we have what looks like sort of more like a 3D cylinder. And then to make the sphere, we just, I don't know why that's happening. To make the sphere, I just made it a radial gradient instead, and I gave it an angle that was off from the center because the default of the radial gradient is, I think, 90 degrees, something like that. Anyway, the default is having it right in the center, like what you see in the icon there. If I want it to look like the light is coming from one side, I have to drag that around. And you can also drag these sliders if you want it to be more black or more sort of abrupt. You can also add additional sliders if you want to be able to have 3 colors or 4 colors or go crazy. So you can really mess with these gradients however you want. There's also a gradient tool. The hotkey is G. And you can, once you select an object and you're in the gradient tool, you can then more directly adjust some of these things if that ends up making more sense to you. So there's ways that you can do that. A hotkey I forgot to tell you about. If you're in any other tool, right, so I'm in the gradient tool now, and I realize that I don't have the object selected that I want to work on. If I hold down Command, it takes me to my selection tool, and then when I release Command, it puts me back to my gradient tool. So similar to panning with the space bar, that's a way to quickly select something without actually changing the tools that you're in. So just these little tricks. Okay, I think that's all we have time for, unless there's something really specific that any of you wanted to see. Text, I forgot to talk about from my poster, but you can create a text box and type into it, and you can change the font the way that you would anywhere else. You can make it centered or justified, all of these options. One thing to be aware of with text is that if I create a text box just by clicking and typing, then you can see if I now change this text box, it's going to distort the text. Whereas on this one, I created a text box by clicking and dragging. And so now I can change the size of that box, and it's not going to affect the size or the shape of my text. If you do this and you're really unhappy about it, go into this character mode, and you can see the percentages of the stretch are messed up. I'm going to just type in 100%, and it's going to go back to its original aspect ratio. So those are some easy ways if you have to resize a plot, for instance. Those are easy ways to get your text to behave. Okay, I will actually stop now. All right, thanks guys for coming.